All right, so we're here today with Mr. Warakomsky to talk about his experiences in the Coast Guard and in the military. And today is January 28th, 2022. It's 1:34 p.m. Could you start off by telling me your birth date and where you were born?
I was born in New London, Connecticut, 4th of December, 1936.
Wow. And then what was your branch of service?
Coast Guard.
Coast Guard. And then your rank and grade?
Retired as a captain.
And then what was your time served? Time served?
The time that I was in active duty in the Coast Guard, not counting academy time, was 25 years.
25 years. Oh, and then could you talk about, were you deployed anywhere with the Coast Guard?
Well, I wouldn't use the word deployed as much as I would use the word assigned. I was an unusual case in terms of the number of assignments I had during my career because of a couple of circumstances. Number one, I got my graduate degree in electrical engineering, so I was working on electronic aids to navigation, and at that time the Coast Guard was a little bit short of electronic engineers working on electronic aids to navigation, so I served 4 years aboard ship right out of the academy. Then I went to school. Then I stayed in electronics virtually for the rest of my career.
Oh, wow.
At the time that I was eligible to go to Vietnam, that was when they had a critical shortage. So they didn't send me to Vietnam. They kept me working on electronic aids to navigation.
Oh, okay. And then where did you earn your commission?
I'm sorry?
When did you earn your commission?
Oh, I was commissioned in 1958.
And via the Coast Guard Academy?
Yes.
And what made you decide to go to the Coast Guard Academy and join the Coast Guard?
Well, my uncle was a Coast Guard officer, and being an impressionable teenager, I thought that was pretty good. I was very impressed. A neighbor across the street where I lived was also in the Coast Guard. My cousin, who was my uncle's father, no, my cousin was my uncle's son. He and I were very close, and his father at the time was CEO of a ship in Boston and invited us to go up and spend some time on the ship while it was in port. So that was also impressionable. The more I investigated about the difference between the services, Army, Navy, prepared for war. The Coast Guard was always a peacetime operation. And so that's probably what had the most influence on me to choose the Coast Guard Academy. About a month before I was to report to the Coast Guard Academy, I received an appointment to the Naval Academy.
Wow.
Next door neighbor was a naval person. So as a teenager, I was in a dilemma. Should I go in the Navy or should I go in the Coast Guard? Well, the Coast Guard won out. So.
Wow, so did you apply to the Naval Academy as well?
Back in the day, the application was contacting your senator or representative and ask for an appointment. And when particular senator that I asked said yes, then I had to take an exam. what they call the civil service exam. I don't know what you're going through today. I have no idea
It sounds very different.
what the routine is today, but I had to take an exam, 2-day exam plus an interview, which I also took for the Coast Guard too, same thing. I was first alternate, so that's why a month before I was due to report to Coast Guard Academy, I got the appointment to the Naval Academy because the primary appointment person decided not to go.
Oh, okay.
So they gave it to me. So the rest is history.
And what were your experiences at the Coast Guard Academy?
While I was at the academy,
Yes, sir.
the most memorable experiences were taking cruises on the Eagle. You know what the Eagle is?
Yes, sir.
And probably the most memorable, oh, there have been several memorable, but climbing to the very top of the mast and touching the light that's on the tip of the mast was something that we all had to do as cadets.
Wow.
And climbing up the last part of the mast was just a rope ladder called a Jacob's ladder. It had 2 pieces of rope vertically and then some rope in between like this. And it lays directly against the mast. So here you are 180 feet above the deck, trying to get your foot inside the line. So that was exciting. Going through a couple of hurricanes. When I was a 4th classman, that was a freshman, did a summer cruise to Bermuda. And there were 2 types of vessels. One was the Eagle, the other one was a large cutter. And so cadets in my class took turns going to Bermuda. I sailed on the cutter. Coming back from Bermuda, I sailed on the Eagle, and we went through a hurricane. I remember a hurricane that passed through my hometown back in 1938. I was 2 years old. I still remember it. I was terrified.
Wow.
Because of the wind, sound of the wind, etc. But being at sea and going through hurricanes, another thing. I remember getting out of my bunk. Well, I shouldn't say bunk. We slept in hammocks at the time. And of course the hammock slung between 2 bars. As the ship rolled, the hammock just stayed steady.
Oh, wow.
So I had no idea of the motion of the ship until I jumped out of the hammock. And then my first impression when I went on deck was to see as high as I could see. That was the sea. We were in a trough. I said, oh my God, are we ever going to get out of this? Well, I still had to stand a watch. I stood a watch on top of the pilot house, which is like a little cabin on the after deck. And a big wave came crashing aboard and caught me and swept me right into the lifelines.
Wow.
And if those lifelines weren't there, you wouldn't be sitting here talking to me. I would have been swept right overboard.
Wow, that's incredible.
The water just poured over me, and I had nothing I could do except leaning against the lifeline and saying, oh my gosh, hope this passes.
Wow.
So that was my first introduction to a really rough sea.
And that was while you were a cadet?
Oh yeah, I was a cadet. Let's see, I entered in July, and we did this cruise in August.
Wow.
So I was only a cadet for maybe 2 months.
Oh my gosh, that's crazy.
That's a good initiation.
Yes, sir. And did you meet any major people during your time at the academy that influenced your career?
Probably the most influence on my career was an officer who taught electronics. We had, as a first classman, which is a senior, we had to take an electronics course, and I loved that. And I said to myself, I think I'm going to pursue a career in the Coast Guard in electronics. So I would say he had probably the most influence, and the other one was one who taught electrical engineering, which is different than electronics. Electrical engineering is the power stuff you see, power lines, etc. Distribution systems inside of buildings, things like that. So I enjoyed that course too, but the one in electronics was by far the one that influenced my career.
Oh, wow. And you said you served during the Vietnam War era.
I did. During the Vietnam War, I was at the site called the Electronics Engineering Center, and I made a contribution to the war effort, even though I didn't go to Vietnam. Without going into a lot of detail, the Coast Guard operated a long-range aid to navigation that was extremely accurate, and they built a chain, 4 stations, to provide coverage for Vietnam. There was a problem with receiving the signals and get processed by the equipment because there was a British navigation system that was also installed there. And it was interfering with the reception of the Loran signal. And so a lot of effort put in to how are we going to combat that. And then finally I designed a system that the Loran transmitters themselves transmitted energy out of phase with this interfering signal so that it canceled itself when it was received.
Wow.
So that allowed the U.S. Air Force to use the Loran navigation for precise bombing. Precision bombing, accurate within, at that time, 10 feet. Today's GPS is a lot more accurate, but at the time, and that was in the early 60s, 10 feet was good enough for them to lay bombs.
Wow. That's really cool.
And take off and land in 0 visibility.
Wow.
That was the first instance of aircraft actually landing with 0 visibility. They were using the Loran system totally.
That's super cool. Let's see. And then, where were you? You were assigned mostly in the U.S., right?
No. I served 4 years in London, where I was in charge of all the Loran stations across the Atlantic Ocean. I visited every one of them.
Wow.
They were located in out-of-the-way places you probably never even heard of, like the island of Jan Mayen.
Yeah, I've never heard of that before.
Norwegian. Another one is Ejde, E-J-D-E, which is owned by the Danish. I went to Iceland many times, and we, from London, were responsible for a station in Cape Race, Newfoundland, Germany, where else? Mediterranean Sea. So I had a lot of travel that I did when I was in London.
Wow. That's awesome.
I think you should have heard when you were interviewing Norman, Jim Norman. He was a civil engineer working on Loran Towers. So he must have told you about those.
He did, yes sir.
Okay.
All right, and then You talked a little bit about your first impressions at the academy and being on the Eagle, but what were your first impressions once you earned your commission and were in the service?
Well, I was assigned aboard a ship in Boston. That ship did what we call weather patrols. The ship went out and patrolled a station, a known station that provided geographic information to aircraft, transatlantic aircrafts. Navigation systems in those days were not as sophisticated and accurate as they are today. And every aircraft that flew the route from the US to Europe flew over our stations. We had 4 stations in the Atlantic Ocean, and there were stations in the Pacific also. But on the ship I served on, I went to all those stations, spent about a month. It was very boring, but the service that we provided was pretty essential, since those aircraft needed to have they needed to know where they were. So we could always tell them where they were, except if we ran into some bad weather and we couldn't get star sights, we had to give them electronic information, and the electronic information was not necessarily as dependable as the sights when you were able to see the stars and the sun. But we gave them what we had, and they were very pleased with it. In fact, the people who were talking to the aircraft developed a relationship because they started talking to the same pilots all the time.
Wow.
So it was pretty interesting. I also went through a hurricane on the ship. This time it was a little different. We were out on station, I think it was Bravo, which was in between Greenland and Labrador. And the captain decided he was going to run away from the storm by putting the stern of the ship such that the ship was going with the wind. And CO was afraid to turn around because the water was so rough and the waves were so high. He didn't want to risk turning the ship around. We kept getting closer and closer to Labrador. Finally, the eye of the storm passed over us. And that is a weird feeling because the sea becomes very confused because you got wind going one way and going another way in the eye, and all of a sudden it becomes calm. Look up, I could see the sun.
Wow.
You know, when you see on the television the satellite pictures of hurricanes, there's a big eye. It's just a dark hole that you see because it's taken way up in space. But on the bottom of that hole, you can look up and you see blue sky and sun and everything else.
Wow. And was it really big, or was it just kind of a small thing and then the other side?
They vary, but this one was fairly big because I don't know, like 10, 15 minutes we were steaming along, and that's when the captain turned the ship, and we could see the sun.
Wow.
It's a weird feeling. Then all of a sudden, it's gone, and the wind is howling, and the seas are building up again. I remember it particularly because we had one seaman who was working in the laundry, which on our ship was below decks on the stern. Water was breaking over the stern and getting in through the vents, and that seaman was very scared. He says, "Sir, I'm really afraid. I don't like being here." I said, "Well, you have to buck up because we're here. We're going to be all right. The ships have amazing ability to right themselves. I remember on one patrol, we took a roll that threw me out of my bunk, but the ship went upright again. It can roll, depending on the ship, but the ship I was on could roll 65 or 70 degrees and still turn right side.
That's amazing.
You don't know about those things. Ships like cruise ships can't do that.
Mm-hmm.
Because their whole thing is up decks. You know, they have decks up nine stories high. And that gives them quite a bit of instability in rough weather. But they put things on the ships on those cruise ships that reduce the rocking. But if it ever took a severe roll, you probably wouldn't recover. And that's the job of the captain, to make sure that he doesn't put himself in a position to have such a roll.
Mm-hmm.
They do occur what they call rogue seas, that out of nowhere a big wave will come, and if the ship is broadside to that wave, that's bad news. So people on watch have to be very careful to observe what the sea conditions are at all times, because the way you would treat a rogue wave is to turn into it, and that it'll pitch vertically like this, but it's not going to roll like this. Pitching vertically it's fun, actually. You get this sensation when the ship goes on a big wave and it goes up like this, and the wave passes beneath it,
Wow.
falls. You know, it's out of the water,
Mm-hmm.
and it falls, and you get a thrill as you do rides and carnivals in Disney World and things like that to give you a thrill. I remember we were steaming, it was in the north, about Bravo Patrol, and we ran into a storm, and the ship was pitching like this. Get up in the morning, whole ship was full of ice.
Wow.
And that hurt stability too, so we had to send parties out to chip all the ice off the ship.
And was the climate really cold up there?
Yeah, in the wintertime. Oh yeah. Cold enough to freeze salt water.
Wow. What kind of challenges did you face as an engineer?
Well, see, I was a naval engineer on the ship. Now, you talk about as a naval engineer or an electronics engineer?
Both.
Challenges as a naval engineer, one of the biggest ones I had was we had some foul substance in the oil system, and we had to identify it, because if we didn't, it would have caused great destruction of our turbines. And that was a challenge, to find out what the problem was in the oil. Electronics, always problems. In terms of, as an electronic engineer, I think I told you I was working with electronic aids navigation, and Loran was the specific thing I was working with, and I talked about Loran in Vietnam. A lot of times, the biggest challenges were to ensure that the transmission pulse, the electronic device, navigation device, worked on pulses. And a pulse had a certain, pulse can go like that, or a pulse can go straight up. We had to get it so that it went as high as possible, as fast as possible, and that was a challenge. I used to go around to all the stations trying to tune things up so that they could get that maximum pulse rise time. What else? Oh, challenge. The Loran C, when I say Loran, it's Loran C. There's a Loran A, a Loran B, and a Loran C. So Loran C is long range. There was a problem. The space agency used Loran C to time everything that they tracked. Missile tracking, space vehicle tracking, back in the 60s, that was just at the start of all this stuff. And so Loran C used a cesium oscillator, a nuclear oscillator that provides stability. A clock run by a cesium oscillator would lose 1 second every 13 years. That's how accurate it was. It had to be accurate for navigation purposes too. The space agency said, we want to get our timing set by using the Loran navigation system. Can you help us? So I designed a modification to the transmitting and timing equipment so that the transmitter could transmit 1 pulse every second. In addition to all the Loran pulses, it was transmitting another pulse every second, and that's what provided the timing throughout the northern hemisphere. Loran was not in the southern hemisphere, only the northern hemisphere.
Really?
There was another navigation system that covered the world with 13 stations. But it didn't lend itself to do a 1 pulse per second because it was a continuous wave as opposed to pulses. So that was a challenge to design, build, test, install it. I went out to install it on Johnston Island in the Pacific. And then I had to write a operating manual for it.
Wow.
So I was involved in the whole thing. Designed printed circuit boards, printed circuit cards. This was the first time that printed circuit cards were used. So I was kind of a leader in that respect, making use of all those techniques which were brand new at that time. And we've come a long way since then, baby.
That's really cool, really incredible. And what advice do you think at the end of your career you would have given yourself as a new officer?
You mean upon graduation and going to my first assignment, or looking back at my career saying, now that I've already had a career, what advice would I give?
Yes, sir.
Is that what you're looking for?
Yes, sir.
You should have brought the books. Do you want to go get something in the library?
The best advice is always do your best. Do not give up. No matter how hard the problem is, no matter how difficult the situation that you find yourself in is, don't give up. Keep working at it, because in the end, you will be successful. And I define success with happiness. Was I happy in my career? Did I enjoy my career? Yeah, I enjoyed it because I was successful. And what better thing to do, even for you? The advice I give you, do what you like to do things that are challenging. When times become difficult, just gird yourself up and get through it.
Yes, sir. And how many years did you stay in the Coast Guard?
25.
25. Why did you decide to stay after your initial 4-year service requirement?
Well, first thing was that the Coast Guard sent me to MIT.
Really? For your master's?
Yeah, and so that that didn't come really free because I had to obligate myself to serve 4 more years after graduating. So that was 10 years. I had already 10 years. And then I looked at it and I said, wait a minute, I'm already 10 years. Why should I get out? Because I also went to the University of Alaska for another degree.
Wow.
That the Coast Guard paid for. So they gave me, to me, free education. Of course, all the taxpayers paid it, but it was a free education for me. And how much was that worth? My grandson entered the Coast Guard Academy, and I went to his graduation. He was in Moscow at the time because his father worked for Procter & Gamble and worked in Moscow. And when I gave a little speech, I said that him going to the Coast Guard Academy for 4 years, that education at that time, which was in 2010. I think 2010 was when I did that. At that time, the 4-year education at the Coast Guard Academy was worth, about $350,000.
Wow.
That was back in 2010. Today, it's probably worth more. So, it's something really good for young people like yourself to go into a military academy and get that free education. And then I found that I was doing things that I enjoyed doing in the Coast Guard, so I stayed.
That's amazing. And do you think the skills you learned throughout your time in the Coast Guard carried into what you did after you retired?
Yeah, there was a combination there. So I had certain skills and knowledge when I retired from the Coast Guard, but then I went to work in industry. I was able to bring a lot of what I learned in the Coast Guard into industry, but I also learned a lot in industry. And so with the two, toward the end of my career, I had a pretty good knowledge of how industry works and how the military works, how the government works, because when I was working at headquarters in Washington, I had a lot of dealings with the government, particularly a budgeting cycle, capital expenditures, a lot of things like that. So I had gained quite a bit of knowledge in both professions, both the Coast Guard and civilian.
And what was your profession in the civilian world?
I was a program manager.
Okay.
In charge of all sorts of different programs, classified programs that I can't talk about.
Yes, sir.
Unclassified programs. I did work for the Social Security Administration. The most of my work was done with the Defense Communication Agency, working their communications.
Do you think your experiences and what you decided to do after the military would have differed if you had gone, say, to the Naval Academy instead?
Absolutely. It's a different world, different responsibilities. For instance, in the Coast Guard, at a very young age, people can become commanding officers of land stations. They can become commanding officers of smaller vessels. where in the Navy, you have to wait a while before you become able to be a command person. Although commanders in the Navy do command submarines.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Captains usually do the big ships like battleships and aircraft carriers. Destroyers, probably lieutenant commander even.
And what changes and differences did you notice at the end of your career that was different from when you first joined?
Never thought of that.
Really?
That's one that probably think about. I think the biggest thing was the introduction of workstations.
Mm-hmm.
I was involved in development of what was called at that time the Coast Guard workstation. Today, everybody has a computer. In those days, you didn't have a computer. That was the biggest change I saw, was the introduction of personal electronics for use to work.
Wow.
Yeah, back in the, when was this? Oh, in the 70s. Yeah. When I got out of the Coast Guard and went to work for industry, the first thing they did was, no, actually they didn't. I remember writing letters and reports by hand and giving them to the secretary to manually type.
Wow.
They introduced the Macintosh in my work area, and so everybody had to queue up to use the Mac to produce whatever diagrams, charts, and things like that. So that was the first time that I had actually sat down in front of a terminal and did anything. And that was in the early 80s. People
Wow.
in the early 80s, when I went to work for industry, people did not have their own personal computer.
That's incredible. And if you think about it today, everyone has their own devices. So.
That's right. You don't go to work without a computer.
Mm-hmm. I can't imagine what it must have been like back then.
It was a whole different world.
Yes, sir. What was your life like in the service while you were active? Were you able to spend a lot of time with your family?
When I was in England, London for 4 years, I used to go on a trip to a visitor station once every 4 or 5 weeks. When I was aboard ship, I was in a month, out a month. So I saw my family for half a year.
Wow.
Essentially. And same thing when I was in England. All the other assignments I had, except when I was on the road for a trip or something, I had normal association with family. And I started out this conversation by saying that I was an unusual person because of so few assignments. After graduation from the academy, I had 4 years on a ship, 2 years at MIT, 4 years at the Electronics Center that I mentioned, 4 years in London, and I was transferred to Alaska. I had 4 years, 3 years in Alaska, and came back from Alaska to headquarters here in the DC area. That was in 1975, and I've been in here in this area since 1975. So how many was that? That was the ship. MIT, Wildwood, London, Alaska, Washington. So I had 6 moves, that's all,
Wow.
for a 25-year career.
That's
Most
amazing.
of the other services, it's 2 to 3 years max in
Mhm.
any one place before they send you somewhere else. So that's why I was very unusual.
Wow. And when did your service end?
I retired from the service in 1985. Is that right? Yeah, 85.
And what was your transition experience out of the military and into finding a job in industry?
I found it fairly easy. At that time, there was one person who held a course called and Strategy for Career Transition. And it was held in the Pentagon. And I took that course and gave you all sorts of hints on how to interview, what to wear, how to write a resume, and other things to expect. And I went through that fine, and most of what I encountered was pretty much the way it had been presented to me. Nowadays, they do a whole different thing. They have mentors and sponsors and for people that are retiring.
Wow.
They have special retirement days.
That's great. So it gives people a lot of different opportunities to find out what they're gonna do next.
Yep, yep.
Did you have any plans after when you were deciding to retire, or did you say I'm just gonna go into it, see what I can find, that sort of thing?
Are you talking about retiring from the Coast Guard?
Yes, sir.
Well, I wanted to do essentially what my background was, so that I would be familiar and enjoy doing what I'm doing. So that's how I became a program manager.
Okay.
Was using my Coast Guard electronics background in program management, in budgeting. So a lot of people, when they retire, say, I want to do something totally different. Well, that's fine too.
Wow.
I didn't go that path. So yeah, I knew what I wanted to do.
That's great that you could find that connection.
Yeah.
And kind of bridge into where you left off and into your new job.
Right. And it was a whole new experience in terms of functioning with people and learning new things, going out and representing the company at various shows or other companies that we collaborated with. So it was a new experience, but the basic fundamental things were the same.
Okay. That's excellent. And that's all the questions I had. Is there anything you'd like to add or talk about?
I had a lot of experience flying aircraft.
Really?
Not navigating, not driving it as a passenger, because I traveled so much. And there were some places that I vividly recall. For instance, going into a Loran station in Greenland, which was operated by the Danish people. We had to land in an airport that was at the end of a very long and steep canyon.
Wow.
And I remember people telling me that during the war, during World War II, when planes, U.S. planes, were proceeding to that airport, they got confused, whatever, their navigation wasn't good, they always ended up flying down a blind canyon and crashing. So that was always my thought when I was going down this canyon, seeing canyon walls on my right and my left, and we're in the middle going down. I said, oh, geez, boy, I hope these guys know what they're doing. And they did, obviously. So we landed. Taking off was another thing that I had never experienced before. These were gasoline or petroleum aviation gas piston engine aircraft, 4 engines. The pilot got to the end of the runway and stayed there and continually applied power and reduced power to each of the engines multiple times.
Wow.
So we were just sitting there while he was going, this engine, this engine. Saying, what the heck are they doing that for? Well, I found out why they did it. Because when they take off, these were, like I said, piston engines, not jets. You don't go shooting straight up. You go off gradually. And so to get out of the canyons that are, high, the plane takes off and then circles like this, gaining altitude until it's high enough to fly over the canyon. That's why they tested those engines, because if they had an engine failure, give up. So that was interesting to me. A useless fact that I now know. And of course, they don't do that at all nowadays.
Yeah.
A jet engine can, even commercial jets, if they have to, they can go pretty fast, straight up, or almost straight up. But they wouldn't do that because they'd scare all the passengers.
Yeah. Did they have gas-powered aircraft throughout your service then?
I flew a lot of jets. When I was in England, they introduced the 747. And I saw that a lot. In fact, one day we were downtown just sightseeing, and the Concorde flew over.
Wow.
So they introduced the supersonic jet while I was flying. I flew all sorts of different aircraft, 2-engine flights, jet flights. One time we were going into Ida, the island that I mentioned between Norway and Iceland. Best way to describe it. When we were coming in, going in, pilot took off, circled around. The wind was very strong, and Ida is a mountainous collection of islands. He did this about 3 or 4 times. Finally landed. I got out of the aircraft. The pilot was sitting just like this, drenched in sweat.
Oh my gosh.
Because it was such a difficult landing.
Wow.
So, yeah, I've had some good experiences. Flying today is easy compared to what I went through then in those days.
Wow, it's incredible to think about how much technology's changed.
Oh yeah, yeah. And I've seen it. That's the good thing, is that I've seen it the way it was. Well, I was born right when television was invented.
Really?
But it wasn't commercially available until, I'd say 1947, 48. remember watching the first TV shows. Imogene Coca. I can't remember the name of the show, but I remember Imogene Coca. Of course, you probably never heard of her, unless you look it up in Wikipedia. Yeah, so I've seen the advent of commercial television and all these, I think, productivity tools, entertainment tools, whatever you use the iPad for or computer for, entertainment, play games, or use it for design. It's amazing.
And do you remember what World War II was like
I do.
while you were going through that? And you were a teenager during that time.
No, World War II was, I would say, it was started at the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, and it ended in 1945 with the dropping of the atomic bomb on Okinawa. So during those years, 41 to 45, I remember them. My father was drafted. He didn't serve. He was drafted toward the end of the war and ended up going to Europe in the occupation forces with the U.S. Army occupied Germany, helping them to rebuild. So I remember that. I remember when Pearl Harbor occurred. I was in my house and I heard this loudspeaker this big speaker mounted on top of a car. It was going down every street. America declares war on Japan.
Wow.
That's how we got it. The news the fastest was by this car running around every street and broadcasting, "We're at war, we're at war." I remember the rations, gasoline ration, no butter. We had margarine. I remember getting the margarine in 1 pound cakes, just like a pound of butter. You go to the store and get a pound of butter. Well, you get them in quarters now. Then we got a block that fit the same size container, but it was a block of white whatever. And we had a little packet of dye. You open the packet of dye, and then you mash up so it looks yellow, and it looked like butter, the margarine.
Wow.
Sugar was rationed. Yeah, I remember all that.
That's incredible. It's amazing that you've been through so many time periods and just seen so much change over that time.
It's hard to say that. I think during my lifetime, the rate of change of technology is the fastest it's ever been.
Yes, sir.
People living through the Industrial Revolution probably thought the same thing when they saw all these great big machines coming in and doing all these things. Oh boy, really making big strides during our lifetime. Yeah, well, that was nothing compared to what we are now.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll say this for you, when you get to be my age, things are going to have changed from where we are today to where you're going to be when you get to be my age. You're going to say, "Oh, that was like the old Stone Age." That's how technology is going to completely capture everything we do.
Wow. Well, thank you very much for meeting with us and talking to us today. And thank you for your service.
Well, thank you.